In the summer of 1881, the Arctic landscape around Lady Franklin Bay presented an austere and almost unbroken expanse of ice and rock. The waters of the bay, still dotted with floating ice, reflected the pale sun that hovered near the horizon. Mountains and ridges rose sparsely along the coastline, but much of the terrain was flat, covered in snow and scattered patches of exposed rock. The air was cold even in midsummer, carrying a sharp tang of ice and water. The bay itself was isolated. To the south lay hundreds of miles of open Arctic terrain before any settlements or trading posts could be reached. The nearest European or American assistance was over 800 miles away, accessible only by ship or arduous overland travel. The ice-laden waters and shifting floes marked the boundary between the known world and the vast, empty expanse of the polar region. The environment was quiet, save for the sound of cracking ice and occasional wind gusts that moved across the snowfields. There were no human structures, no roads, and no clear paths. Driftwood washed ashore in scattered quantities, while small animals and migratory birds moved intermittently across the tundra. For those arriving by ship, the bay appeared both vast and desolate, a place where survival depended entirely on preparation and adaptation. From the deck of the relief ship, the island-like ridges and frozen stretches suggested both opportunity and constraint. While the bay offered a potential base for observation and scientific work, it provided no natural shelter from storms, no cultivated land, and only the barest resources. Ice and water dominated the landscape, and human presence was negligible. The bay, the ice, and the surrounding terrain were indifferent, observing the arrival of men who would soon confront the limits of isolation. For the 25 men of the expedition, the Arctic frontier represented a quiet challenge. The environment was still, neutral, and imposing, a space that demanded respect. At this moment, danger had not yet arrived, but the scale and remoteness of the region made clear that their endurance would be tested, not by a single event, but by the relentless conditions of ice, cold, and distance. The men sent to Lady Franklin Bay were part of the United States Army Signal Corps expedition, led by Lieutenant Adolphus Greely. Their mission, officially titled the Lady Franklin Bay Expedition, had a dual purpose: scientific observation and Arctic exploration. The expedition was tasked with establishing a research station, collecting meteorological and magnetic data, and conducting mapping surveys of the northern reaches of Greenland and the Canadian Arctic. It was one of the most ambitious American polar projects of the era. Greely himself was 33 years old at the time of departure, a career military officer with experience in surveying and meteorology. The team of 24 men accompanying him had been carefully selected for their skills, though not all had direct experience in extreme Arctic conditions. Among the group were meteorologists, surveyors, carpenters, hunters, and soldiers accustomed to rigorous physical labor. Their backgrounds were varied. Some had previously served in the military, others in scientific or engineering roles, and a few had experience in northern or frontier regions. Collectively, they represented a combination of discipline, training, and technical expertise, though none had faced prolonged isolation in the high Arctic. Preparation for the expedition included months of planning. Supplies were collected and packed into crates, including preserved meats, flour, rice, beans, and other staples intended to last for several years. Tools for constructing shelters, sledges, and small boats were included, along with tents and scientific instruments. Clothing suitable for the Arctic climate, heavy wool, fur-lined boots, and protective outer layers, was distributed, though the materials were heavy and cumbersome. The expectation was that supply relief would arrive annually by ship, which would transport additional provisions and collect observations. The journey north began aboard the USS Proteus, which carried the men and their equipment along the Labrador coast and across the waters of Baffin Bay. Ice floes and narrow passages required careful navigation. The men were in high spirits, aware of the remoteness they were entering but confident in their preparation and leadership. Scientific instruments were calibrated during transit, and routines for daily duties were established on the ship. The group was trained to work together, balancing research tasks with survival readiness for the challenges ahead. Upon arrival at Lady Franklin Bay in August 1881, the men disembarked onto a small, ice-strewn plateau near the shore. The site was chosen for its proximity to open water, allowing sledging and potential supply landings, while also offering flat areas for constructing shelters. The surrounding terrain was predominantly tundra, interspersed with patches of snow and low ridges. Icebergs drifted in the bay, and the wind carried cold currents from the northern glaciers. Though the land appeared barren, the men began establishing temporary tents and arranging supplies in anticipation of the coming winter. The isolation of the bay was immediate and absolute. To the south and west, hundreds of miles of sea ice separated the station from inhabited areas. The men understood that any miscalculation could be fatal, and that success depended not only on skill and discipline but also on the precise timing of supply deliveries. The combination of environmental harshness and logistical distance defined the limits of their potential endurance. Despite the remoteness, there was a methodical calm in their work. Shelters were erected, instruments positioned, and provisions inventoried. Each man understood the role he would play in both scientific and survival tasks. The expedition represented a balance between human organization and environmental constraint. Preparation, skill, and planning stood against the vast indifference of the Arctic. This framework would guide them through the early months, though the true test of endurance lay in the coming isolation and unforeseen difficulties. By late August 1881, the expedition had completed the initial setup of their station at Lady Franklin Bay. Temporary tents and shelters had been replaced with more permanent structures constructed from timber, driftwood, and available materials. Scientific instruments were in place, and stores of food and fuel had been organized. At first glance, the site suggested stability, yet the men were fully aware of the isolation that defined their location. The remoteness became tangible as the Proteus departed, carrying the ship and its crew south to winter ports. The expedition remained behind, hundreds of miles from the nearest settlements or means of rapid assistance. The ice-filled bay was their boundary, and beyond it lay only the Arctic expanse. Communication with the outside world depended entirely on supply ships scheduled to arrive the following summer, months away. Any error, delay, or environmental obstacle would magnify the distance separating them from help. Early challenges began immediately. Ice floes shifted unpredictably in the bay, making landing and sledging operations difficult. Temperatures dropped sharply as autumn approached, shortening daylight hours and emphasizing the vulnerability of both men and provisions. Small accidents, minor miscalculations, or delayed tasks now carried weight. Even routine activities required careful coordination and attention. The men recognized that mistakes could not easily be corrected, and that survival would rely on adherence to established procedures and disciplined use of resources. With the departure of the ship, the expedition had passed a critical threshold. Any decision they made, whether in rationing supplies or responding to the environment, could not be undone quickly. Isolation was no longer theoretical, it was immediate and absolute. The Arctic landscape, once a backdrop to their work, now imposed itself as a governing force over daily life. The risk inherent in the environment and the immense distance to potential rescue defined a point of no return, one from which only adaptation and careful management could allow continued survival. The men continued their scientific observations, mapping, and meteorological recordings, yet every task was now performed under the constant awareness that failure had real consequences. Exposure, dwindling resources, and unpredictable ice patterns created tension that could not be alleviated by external support. The Arctic, quiet and indifferent, had become a strict and immutable authority. For Lieutenant Greely and his men, the moment the Proteus left marked the start of a prolonged test of human endurance, isolation, and discipline. With the Proteus departed, the men of the Greely Expedition settled into the routines that would define their daily existence. The first weeks after the ship's departure were occupied with reinforcing shelters and organizing the stockpiled supplies. Timber was scarce, but driftwood from the bay was collected to fortify lean-tos and construct windbreaks around the main living areas. Snow and ice were shoveled to create rudimentary barriers against the cold, and floors were layered with mats, brush, and whatever insulating material could be found. Even minimal improvements in shelter offered measurable benefits against wind and temperature fluctuations. Rationing became a central concern. Supplies included flour, salted meats, rice, beans, and other staples, designed to last through the long Arctic winter. Lieutenant Greely implemented strict allocations, weighing rations carefully to extend their availability. Every man was responsible for measuring his portions, and daily logs tracked consumption to prevent waste or hoarding. The discipline in food management became critical, particularly as the month stretched on and environmental conditions reduced the men's ability to supplement their diet through hunting or foraging. Hunting and foraging were limited by both geography and experience. The surrounding tundra offered sparse wildlife, mostly migratory birds and occasional small mammals, and opportunities were seasonal. Men with prior experience in northern climates were responsible for organizing hunting parties and teaching basic skills to others. Improvised tools were fashioned from available materials, and knowledge of ice conditions was applied to avoid unnecessary risk. Fishing from the bay or nearby rivers required careful observation of currents and ice openings. These activities were slow, dangerous, and often yielded only marginal returns, yet they provided both sustenance and a sense of purpose. The expedition also maintained a rigorous schedule of scientific observation. Meteorological readings, magnetic measurements, and geographical surveys continued despite the challenges. Instruments required calibration and daily care, a task that demanded attention even as physical strength waned. These activities provided structure to the day, reinforcing discipline and focus. They also served as a mental anchor, connecting the men to the mission for which they had been sent, even as survival became increasingly difficult. Adaptation to the environment extended beyond the physical. Men learned to adjust to the short daylight hours, using artificial light sparingly and conserving energy during periods of extended darkness. Firewood was rationed carefully. Stoves were stoked intermittently to maintain warmth while conserving fuel. Clothing, layered and adjusted constantly, became essential to survival, with repairs made using scraps of fabric or fur. Even small lapses in judgment could result in frostbite or hypothermia, highlighting the stakes of disciplined routine. Over the first winter, the men developed a system of rotation for essential duties: cooking, maintaining stoves, collecting ice for water, and monitoring instruments. Each rotation balanced the need for survival with the need for continued observation. Leadership under Greely remained structured, though informal hierarchies also emerged within smaller groups. Those with practical skills, carpentry, hunting, medical knowledge, assumed responsibility for tasks critical to sustaining life. Despite these measures, shortages and environmental stressors placed increasing strain on the men. By midwinter, scurvy and early signs of malnutrition began to appear, with fatigue and irritability rising across the camp. Careful rationing and shared labor delayed collapse, but the physical toll was accumulating. Hygiene was limited, water sources were drawn from ice, and waste management was basic. Disease and cold compounded the challenges, testing both endurance and morale. The following spring brought limited relief in the form of increased daylight and marginally improved conditions for hunting and fishing. The ice receded slightly, allowing for more accessible movement along the shoreline. Yet the essential isolation remained unchanged. Relief ships scheduled for resupply did not arrive, leaving the expedition entirely dependent on stored provisions and their ability to endure the environment. Throughout this period, the men displayed methodical perseverance. Daily tasks, though repetitive and physically demanding, became the measure of survival. The Arctic, indifferent to human effort, dictated terms through temperature, ice, and scarcity. Every decision carried weight: how to divide rations, when to venture onto ice, and which shelters to reinforce. Success was measured not in scientific achievements, but in the continuation of life itself. As the months wore on, the limits of the expedition's endurance became increasingly apparent. Supplies dwindled more rapidly than anticipated, and the physical condition of the men deteriorated. Even with strict rationing, caloric intake was insufficient to sustain normal activity in the extreme cold. Muscles weakened, and fatigue became pervasive. Scurvy, caused by a lack of vitamin C, manifested in bleeding gums, weakness, and joint pain, reducing the men's capacity to perform essential tasks. The discipline that had maintained order during the first months began to falter. Minor disputes over remaining food escalated, and informal hierarchies were challenged by desperation. Some men attempted to hoard provisions or skip duties, while others, weakened by illness, could not contribute. The rotation of responsibilities, cooking, maintaining fires, gathering ice, grew increasingly burdensome as strength declined. Shelter construction and maintenance became laborious, and the risk of exposure increased as the men struggled to complete even basic tasks. Hunting and foraging yielded diminishing returns. Birds and small animals were scarce, and ice conditions limited movement across the tundra. Fishing from partially frozen waters required long hours in freezing temperatures, often producing only minimal sustenance. Despite these efforts, starvation became a constant presence. The men's physical and cognitive abilities were impaired, leaving them vulnerable to misjudgment and injury. Disease compounded the effects of hunger. Dysentery spread rapidly in the close quarters of the camp, exacerbated by limited hygiene and contaminated water. Respiratory infections emerged, fueled by cold, damp conditions and inadequate nutrition. Frostbite and hypothermia claimed fingers, toes, and limbs, further reducing the ability of individuals to participate in survival tasks. The interplay of malnutrition, illness, and environmental exposure created a slow, relentless decline. Psychological strain intensified. Days merged into nights, and the monotony of survival tasks, gathering ice, maintaining fires, monitoring instruments, blurred perception of time. The Arctic, once a neutral backdrop, became a constant and oppressive force. Fear, uncertainty, and exhaustion heightened tension within the group. Some men withdrew, physically and mentally, while others became irritable or confrontational. Historical records indicate that by the second winter, the conditions had reached critical severity. Deaths increased as the combination of hunger, scurvy, and exposure claimed the weak. The surviving men faced choices dictated by necessity rather than preference. Reports of cannibalism among the most desperate highlight the extreme pressure imposed by total isolation and lack of sustenance. These acts were not casual but arose from the intersection of starvation, proximity to death, and absence of alternative resources. Despite these losses, some level of order remained. Lieutenant Greely continued to enforce rationing and maintain records of the dead and surviving. Efforts to hunt, fish, and fortify shelters persisted, though the physical toll limited effectiveness. Survival was measured in hours and days, with each small accomplishment, the preparation of a meal, the maintenance of a fire, the construction of a shelter, representing a narrow extension of life. By the end of this period, the expedition was reduced to a fraction of its original strength. 25 men had begun the mission. By the spring of 1883, only 7 were still alive. The environment had imposed its limits, and human endurance had been tested to the utmost. The Arctic remained indifferent, yet the systematic, disciplined approach to survival had prolonged life for those who remained, allowing them to await eventual rescue. In June 1884, more than 2.5 years after their arrival at Lady Franklin Bay, relief ships finally reached the surviving members of the expedition. The USS Thetis and USS Bear, sent to assess and retrieve the stranded men, approached the station cautiously, aware of the hazards of Arctic ice and the difficulty of navigating the bay. The landscape that greeted them was familiar yet altered, lean-tos and shelters, some partially collapsed, scattered across the tundra, alongside remnants of food stores and scientific instruments. Only 7 of the original 25 men were still alive. They were weak, malnourished, and afflicted with the consequences of prolonged exposure to extreme cold and inadequate nutrition. Scurvy, frostbite, and general physical decline were widespread, and some survivors were barely able to stand or walk without assistance. The rescue teams documented the conditions meticulously, recording both the deaths that had occurred and the remaining provisions, noting the limits of what the men had endured. The evacuation proceeded in a controlled, methodical manner. Survivors were carefully assisted aboard the ships, and those too weak to move independently were carried or supported. Medical treatment was minimal but sufficient to stabilize the most critical cases during the journey south. Officers documented the relief process, creating official reports that would later inform both historical accounts and military records of the expedition. The aftermath of the Greely Expedition highlighted the consequences of isolation, environmental severity, and delayed relief. The deaths, the physical decline of survivors, and the evidence of extreme survival measures underscored the limits of human endurance when distance, weather, and inadequate supply intersect. Scientific instruments, logs, and journals were collected as records of both achievement and endurance under conditions of extreme adversity. The Arctic itself remained unchanged, indifferent to the human experience. Ice, wind, and snow continued their slow, silent rhythms. The survival of the 7 men was not a story of triumph but a testament to the disciplined routines, adaptation, and resilience that had allowed life to persist under conditions that had claimed the majority of the expedition. The rescue provided closure, yet the environment had exacted its toll in full measure. The story of the Greely Expedition remains a measured record of human endurance under extreme isolation. The Arctic, vast and indifferent, imposed conditions that tested physical strength, mental discipline, and social cohesion. Hunger, cold, and disease revealed the boundaries of human adaptation, demonstrating how environmental and logistical constraints shape survival. Historically, the expedition illustrates both the consequences of planning and the limitations of preparation. The men were trained, disciplined, and organized, yet even these qualities could not entirely counter the challenges of distance, weather, and delayed resupply. The reduction from 25 men to 7 survivors serves as a stark testament to the combined weight of environmental hardship and human vulnerability. In retrospect, the significance lies in observation rather than dramatization. Scientific work was conducted alongside survival, and careful records preserved both achievements and losses. The endurance of the men provides insight into human behavior when stripped to essentials. Routine, rationing, adaptation, and quiet persistence became the framework of existence. The Arctic, silent and unyielding, remained the constant measure against which human survival was tested. The expedition concludes without embellishment. There is no celebration, only documentation of life preserved, losses endured, and lessons recorded. The experience of the 22 men, those who survived the longest distances from aid, offers a restrained, factual reflection on endurance, human limits, and the vast scale of the polar environment.